Welcome to the panel. This is Ayn Rand and the New Atheists. I have Robert Mayhew with me. We'll both talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions, and Robert will begin.
Okay. This is pretty much a continuation, in a sense, a continuation of my lecture from earlier today, just finished. But I think it's intelligible even if you missed that. I was going to say if you had the audacity to miss that, but after the scheduling changes, I don't really have the right, if I did anyway. There, in the lecture, I contrasted Ayn Rand's conception of the sacred values with theism's or religion's conception. And what I want to do here is briefly contrast her approach to values with that of other atheists, and especially the New Atheists. The New Atheists being Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins. Those are the big four. And there's a lot of fellow travelers and others that fall under that category. And I'll state from the outset the key difference between Ayn Rand and these other atheists in the realm of values. She had, as I said in the question period in the lecture, she had an original, rational, this-worldly conception of man and values, of a heroic view of man, and a rational conception of values. And because of this, she rejected God and religion as degrading to man and whose entire capacity to value. And that's what I talked a lot about in that lecture. Her conception of values was formed completely apart from, and in fact was opposed to, that of religion. Other atheists, by contrast, tend to be radically different. They reject God and religion, often for good reasons and sometimes with good arguments, but almost without exception, to some extent, they accept religion's monopoly on the whole realm of values, as I described that in my lecture. Whether they admit it or not, they do. Now, this creates a dilemma or a problem for these atheists and a challenge. Can we be good without God? Is morality possible without religion? Is anything sacred? These are the kind of questions they raise and attempt to answer. Now, clearly no such dilemma exists for Ayn Rand. On the contrary, you could express her view as, can you be good with, can we be good with God? And her answer is no, you can't, not in the proper sense of that. So setting Ayn Rand aside and looking at the other atheists, given their atheism on the one hand and their acceptance to some degree of the religion's monopoly on values on the other, there's really, I think, two possibilities open to these atheists. Number one is really just to man up and accept that atheism leads to moral relativism. To regard religion and morality as intimately connected, and since you're rejecting religion, well, then you reject the whole realm of any kind of moral code or objective set of values. The other possibility is the view that one can reject religion but nevertheless defend morality and values scientifically or rationally. But what you're defending is the morality that's prescribed by religion, okay? Now, the most striking, I'm going to spend a little time on the first of these, atheism leads to moral relativism. The most striking example of this is Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, and he gave a speech which was later published as a pamphlet called Existentialism is a Humanism. That's from 1946. He's not exactly a new atheist. But here's what he says, quote, "The existentialist finds it very troublesome or annoying or embarrassing, très gênant, excuse my French, very troublesome, I guess, that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. It is nowhere written that the good exists, that one must be honest or must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men. Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And for existentialism is the starting point. Everything is indeed permitted, morally permitted, if God does not exist, and man is in consequence forlorn," unquote. Forlorn, sad. I'm a stranger and afraid in a world I never made. So on this view, there's no objective moral code and no sacred values. There's merely subjective preferences, right? And it's a problem because what we need is a moral code, and yet we don't have one. So Sartre believed in God, and Sartre believed that God and heaven do not exist. Alas, right? And so he neither dreamed of heaven nor demanded it, to use the language of Kira. He did write a play set in hell, but that's another issue. Now, he's not the only one who falls under this category. Michel Foucault, Richard Rorty, there's a bunch of others. But I'm mentioning them really by way of contrast here, because to their credit, none of the new atheists take this approach. That is, none of them embrace moral relativism as a consequence of their atheism. In fact, on the contrary, they argue it very strenuously, however effectively it might be, or ineffectively. They explicitly reject the idea that atheism leads to moral relativism and that it drains life of meaning. They proudly reject faith, and what they want to do is to try to come up with a scientific or rational or conception of morality. And the ones who do this, I guess, at greatest length would be Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. And I will say this, Sam Harris, I have a lot that I disagree with about him, to say the least, but one of the things he's quite good at is being so emphatic about how ridiculous he thinks moral relativism is. And that's actually connected to some of the things, where he's at his best, for example, criticizing Islam. It's often connected with that, with him. Now, Christopher Hitchens, he agrees that morality and meaning are possible without religion, and he does not attempt any philosophical defense of morality, although he's pretty good. In this respect, he says philosophy is now what is needed. You know, kind of, we've gotten rid of religion, now let's turn to philosophy. We need some kind of a new Enlightenment approach to defending this ethics, but he's not, going to do it himself. He's quite good, I think, at a journalistic kind of level in showing how bad religion can be, but that's as far as he goes. Now, Richard Dawkins is an unusual one in this respect. I haven't read his most recent books, but he hopes that we'll be able to ground a moral system in, well, as he puts it, Darwinian biology. Now, all of these fall under possibility 2 that I wrote out. That is, they, virtually without exception, the ethics, the values that the new atheists end up defending, purportedly scientifically and based on Darwinian biology, is in large part traditional morality, that is Christian altruism. Really, there's one difference here. They reject Christian sexual ethics. That's sex is a personal or private issue, and among, anything among consenting adults seems to be okay. But for the rest, they really, the morality they end up defending or trying to defend is Christian altruism. Okay. Now, none of this, I think, should surprise us too much, because most of them are not philosophers, and the one who is, Daniel Dennett, isn't exactly, he's not an original philosopher in the way that Ayn Rand is, certainly not an original ethicist. So these guys, they accept the cultural default setting, and that is altruism of one kind or another. When it comes to values, they do. And I think relevant here is John Galt's line that what you now need is not to return to morality, but to discover it. And Ayn Rand discovered it, but they've not. They've had the same conception that they're going to try to defend. Now, the one who does surprise me the most is Richard Dawkins. I don't want to take too much time with this, but he's rather shocking, and he's also he makes it very obvious how he's starting out with the conception of morality, the one dictated by Christianity, and that he's hoping to reach that, a defense of that. He wrote an essay called Atheists for Jesus. And what he says, he hopes that we can show that the super niceness of Jesus can be defended by Darwinian biology, or made consistent with Darwinian biology. And by super niceness, he means, he quotes at length from the Gospel according to Matthew, from the Sermon on the Mount, and here's just one part of it. He says, quote, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, cetera, unquote. Now, you would think that some rational analysis on his part, if that's really, rigorous, scientifically looking at these statements, as he claims to be doing, and sometimes with great effect, when the questions of the existence of God, you would think he'd come to some good, come up with some good criticisms of this view, especially the ludicrous notion that being nice has something to do with loving your enemies and helping those who hate you. It just, but it's like the critical faculty has ceased to work when it comes to ethics. But he's really blatant about. He's really blatant about this, and I mean his hope that we can defend Christianity, or this aspect of Christianity, not the sexual ethics, but this part of it, that we can defend it scientifically, is almost indistinguishable from a religious person's faith. And here's a passage that's important. Quote, this is from the same essay, Atheists for Jesus. Darwinians can come up with explanations for human niceness, generalizations of the well-established models of kin selection and reciprocal altruism, etc. But the sort of super niceness I'm talking about in humans goes too far. It is a misfiring, even a perversion of the Darwinian take on niceness. Well, if that's a perversion, it's the kind of perversion we need to encourage and spread, unquote. But why? I mean, why would, I think it's unclear that, I think it's clear that he's not arriving at Christian ethics, as the end of some rational process, but he's starting there, and that is very troubling. I had a few notes on Daniel Dennett on sacred values, but I think I should stop here for a bit, right?
Thanks, Robert. I want to focus on, I'm going to start by focusing on the phenomenon of the new atheist, partly as a cultural phenomenon. And I think Robert's remarks touched on this kind of issue as well. It really illustrates in the end the power of philosophy, I think the whole phenomena, and particularly the way, in various ways in which they're undercut. Because I have a basically positive view of the new atheists from this perspective of their essential motivation. So the phenomenon, I think Harris is the first big book in 2004, The End of Faith. And they're responding to 9/11 and the apologies that were made for religion and Islam right after September 11th, made by the president, but all across the culture. And they're good on a lot of critiques of the nature of faith. Harris, I think, is particularly good. He's good on the critiques of religion. There's a focus on Islam, but he broadens it to Christianity and Judaism. He's good on the issue that it's not, what we need is not to reform religion, that what happened with Christianity and Judaism is not that they were reformed, but that they were defanged. That is, that people don't take them that seriously. So it's not that we have to try to redo the content or something like that. We have to lessen their hold on people's minds and try to get rid of them. And he gets it, I mean, that's why it's called The End to Faith. He gets that the issue is faith in any of its variations. And he's good on this kind of criticism as well, which I'm sure that you've heard, that, well, but the communists and the Nazis were atheist and look at the destruction and so on that they caused. And he gets it that, no, these are also forms of faith. And he puts it in those terms. These are secular, I don't know if he uses this term, but they're secularized religions. And he gets that issue and that is what, and they're destructive because of that. That is, so he gets the idea that, and this is an Enlightenment kind of idea, and he quotes Enlightenment figures, either he does or Dawkins does, that if you can get people to believe absurdities, you can get them to commit atrocities. And that's Voltaire. But it gets that issue and gets it in fundamental terms. Another issue, and again, I think Harris is the smartest of them in terms of this issue, not necessarily just in terms of intelligence, but on this issue of religion and of atheism. He's very good on the way that moderates make possible the so-called extremists. that it's the whole phenomenon that we're not supposed to criticize religions. It's okay if you have some ideas on faith as long as you don't take them too far. And he's very, very critical of them, views them as how we would put it, that they're compromisers, and they're paving the road for the real killers, and they make them possible, and that they're not marginalized in society, and that they can get expression and get their hands on political power, and so on. And he's very good on that issue. And they're good on the idea, and I think this is also why it's interesting culturally, they've been able to persuade a lot of people who were religious to question their religion, and for many, I think, to abandon it. And they talk about, and this is part of why they've set up nonprofits and websites. They've had success doing that. And part of what they do and what they say they're doing is that they're giving you breathing room to question these ideas, that there's a lot, and particularly in America, a lot of people who never even dreamed and have seen people who question religion. And that's part of what, and why they want to be public figures, to get this out. Dawkins starts the God Delusion, the book, that it's with a quote, "I didn't know I could." And it's about people who didn't know they could question their religion. And yes, you can start to question it. And when you start to question it, what you'll see is that it unravels. So related to that is the importance of standing up and being seen and being heard and proclaiming with confidence and pride that one is not religious, that one is rejecting this. Both are very good on this, and I think it's part of how they've attracted a lot of people. And as Robert touched on, they're not nihilists. So it's not tear down religion for the sake of tearing down religion. It's that this is a tremendously destructive force in the world. And if 9/11 hasn't shown you that, then you're not really thinking. There's a real challenge to Americans in that regard. But it is done in the name, they think morality is possible, and more generally, and they're both scientists, it's in the name too of science, that if you're to take science seriously, you have to abandon religion. And another thing they're both good on is the idea that somehow faith and reason, or science and religion, are compatible, that they can live together. They are very hostile to that. They're hostile to something like the Templeton Fund that gives millions and millions and millions of dollars for this kind of research and this kind of reconciliation. And they're very critical of that. So on the whole, I think the motivation is essentially positive, essentially good. And I view both of them actually as very courageous. And they've taken a lot of slack, and Harris has taken a lot of slack for his views on Islam and a lot of criticism, and has stood his ground, which I think is admirable. But they're both smart enough to get that the issues involved here go into deep philosophical issues. And when they try to make that transition to straight philosophical issues, they're not very good. Robert talked, and they're awful, really. Robert talked about the issue of morality, but on every aspect of philosophy, they're pretty bad. On the Dawkins is probably worse on this regard than Harris. On the epistemology of it, that can you reject God, and what does it mean to say that God doesn't exist? Well, you can't. Dawkins says you can't be completely certain of that. It's highly probable that he doesn't exist. And there's a confusion, but this is a difficult issue. It's a confusion of epistemological and metaphysical issues. So they're both very reluctant to delve into what the supernatural means and therefore to reject it. This is because Dawkins characterizes God as supernatural, and he still won't reject it completely. It's that, well, there's not much evidence. I don't see any evidence. I'm not going to rule it out completely. And that there's a sort of, the implication is there's a sort of dogmatism involved if you were to rule it out. So, and the whole issue of you touched on this, I think, in the Q&A of your talk, of the axioms, and to understand that the supernatural is a rejection of the axioms of existence, identity, causality. They can't get, and they couldn't even accept the issue of axioms. I think this is particularly true of Harris, but Dawkins as well, and most scientists are like this, because they have and this is an instance of how they take a philosophical view. They take Popper's view of falsifiability, and that's what science is about. And the axioms aren't falsifiable. A is A. I mean, what would it mean for this not to be true? There's no answer to that. And so for them, then it's, well, I can't make use of this. So that would be unscientific to make use of the axiom. So they can't understand the issue of the supernatural, so they can't fully understand even the issue of what is being claimed when people claim that God exists and why they want something above the natural world. They don't get that issue at all. It's similar things in regards to the arbitrary, but I'll skip over that. We could discuss that in the discussion question period. And then, and this is true, I think, of most scientists, again, they think that science, you have to equate it with materialism. And Harris, I think, is worse in this regard than Dawkins. They're both adamant materialists. And Harris takes, well, what that means is a denial of free will. There could not be free will. And he's very critical. I mean, he has a whole book on free will, but even in The Moral Landscape, where he's trying to talk about the issue of morality, there is no such thing as free will. And that you could have done otherwise and so on. And it completely undercuts the whole moral intransigence in regard to Islam and to the religious and so on. And it is, you can go from chapter to chapter, and you're dealing with, in effect, two Sam Harrises. When he's talking about free will, then yeah, you can't really hold people blameworthy. They couldn't have done otherwise. You put people away in the way that you put animals away because, well, you've got a vicious dog and you either have to put it down or put it in a cage. But you don't blame him that he's vicious. He had, and I mean, an explicit discussion like that. And then you turn to the next chapter and he's talking this in The Moral Landscape towards the end. He's very critical of Francis Collins, who was appointed by Obama as director of the National Institutes of Health. And he's one of these guys who's trying to reconcile science and religion. And he shreds him, but he shreds him in a way that you should know better as a scientist and should have done something different. And then the journal Nature is praising Collins, so on, and he attacks Nature. It's like, why are you doing this? But it's all, I mean, you can't take seriously any of the criticisms other than you shouldn't have done this. You could have done something different. Why did you make this choice? Because you're caving into the religionists. And you won't stand up for science, and you won't stand up for yourself. And you lose all the fire if you really take seriously his philosophical views, which he tells you explicitly you should take seriously, and free will's a myth, and it's on the side of religion and the supernatural. So when you delve down, but they realize you have to delve to really address the kinds of issues. You have to delve down into these philosophical kinds of issues of the supernatural, of what truth and falsehood means and how you prove them, and of issues of free will and it's the underpinning of ethics. So they're all bad in regard to that, and it is so. I think it has an effect, but it can't have a lasting effect and people have started to poke holes in all the sort of the foundations of their views. Let me make one last point about the sort of cultural significance of this. So I think it's significant and was good that there were people standing up against religion who got a sizable audience in the aftermath of 9/11. But there's a kind of issue in the culture that I think if it doesn't get addressed, and we're really the only ones who are going to address it, it's disastrous for America. And that's the equation of faith and religion plus capitalism. That is, the two go together. So the right is faith/religion and capitalism, and that's a package. And the left is science and reason, and therefore statism. And you can see both Dawkins and Harris fall into this in various kinds of ways. But it's the kind of packaging. There's climate deniers, climate change deniers, and deniers of evolution, and they're put into a package that this is what the right is about. And if your choice is between you're going to deny evolution or you're going to say Sweden is good, I mean, the more rational people will say that it's non-negotiable that you can deny evolution. And if that is what your view requires, it has to be wrong. And I'm going to the other side, and I'm going to try to make what I can do with the other side. And you see this both in Dawkins and Harris, that they have this kind of view of the right. But I think this is generally the view, and the view among the sort of liberal-leaning, left-leaning people, that it is, if capitalism and economic freedom is packaged with the denial of evolution, to take that example, you can't win. It is impossible. No rational person who's trying to decide is going to pick freedom plus creationism. I mean, it won't happen. And that package has to be undone, or else I don't think capitalism has a chance in America. Okay, let me stop there, and we'll open up for questions and discussion.
Sure.
I have a question regarding why you might think that most of these new atheists come from the life sciences and not the physical sciences on the one hand. And on the other hand, when someone like Stephen Hawking talked about the universe not requiring a creator, that became breaking news. He was on Larry King. The Vatican had a response pretty quickly. But it seems like people are kind of, is it the fact that they're all from the life sciences hurt or help them, or does it make no difference in the end?
Well, some of them do come from the physical sciences. I'm not at the big four we mentioned, but there's a guy, Lawrence Krauss, I think, who's written, what is that called? A Universe from Nothing. And Dawkins heralds the book as doing for the cosmological argument what Darwin did for the teleological argument. But it's really bad, and as a lot of the physicists who deal with these issues are. Do you have anything? But your question is really about why they come from the biological side.
I'm just wondering if it's because the biological sciences tend to be more rational, and the physicists are all stuck in with a lot of that quantum mechanics that may make it harder for them to reject these things. But yet, when one does, it's new. When someone like Stephen Hawking does it, it's breaking news on CNN.
I think there's an element of that. I think there's also an element of, and I think this is true both for Harris and Dawkins, they see how religion trespasses on their fields. So, I mean, for Dawkins, evolution. So the whole idea that you could get, and he talks about this a lot, I mean, convince millions of people that evolution is a myth. That impacts his whole field and the whole view and funding for it, and that's the other kind. Harris talks a lot about the stem cell issue and stem cell research, and that you could have a government cutting off funding for this based on dogma from 2 millennia ago. So there's that kind of issue that it's more palpable, I think, the way in which religion destroys their fields or interferes and then destroys the field. And I definitely think that is a motivation involved here.
Onkar, a few years ago, you were actually on a radio interview where Dawkins was one of the participants, and what was striking to me was how resistant, to put it mildly, he was to your view and to even the idea that there might actually be a rational justification for a morality, albeit one very different from traditional morality. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts, either of you, more broadly on it. My sense is that all of them they're not eager for you guys to point out, hey, there are actual solutions, they would look much different than you think. And if you have any thoughts on why that is.
Yeah, I don't, in that regard, I don't think of Harris and Dawkins as similar. I think Harris is more open to real argument on that kind of question, and he is interested in the foundations of morality. I think there's many things wrong with his view, and in the end, like his view, I wouldn't put it as he's just sort of a straightforward altruist, because he's really interested in the issue of well-being and research into that, though I think it's too, the research is tainted by his materialism. But he's interested in that issue, but it becomes, and he even makes reference to Mill's essay on utilitarianism. There's the same sort of intrinsicism about well-being that Mill has about happiness. And it is, and I think he can't get that issue but it's one of the hardest, if not the hardest issues in philosophy, that your alternatives are not subjectivism or intrinsicism. And particularly in morality, what an objective approach would look like, what that means, is a very difficult issue that I don't think he gets, but I think you could definitely argue with him about. I find Dawkins, and this, you touched on this in your remark, much more conventional in his, so on the radio, you make reference to that BBC radio program. It was, I forget if it was couched in terms of altruism or selfish, or it may have been both, but it was that issue, and it was the issue, you can't question altruism. That was the, not so much you can't have any kind of argument, because he tries to give some kind of evolutionary, but it is that altruism is unquestionable. Everybody knows that this is right, and it's finding justifications for that, and that's much more conventional, and that is hard to argue against. And it's, I think it's important, I think the hardest thing in the world is to be a moral revolutionary, because you have to stand outside of morality, of what's conventionally accepted, criticize it, and have an alternative view. And to have developed that view, you have to be able to question that without becoming a nihilist, of just tearing down. And it's really, really hard. So if they're courageous for standing up to religion and Islam, Ayn Rand is so unbelievably courageous to be able to stand up to altruism and question it, that it's hard to fathom somebody doing that.
I would just add that I would agree that, yeah, I can't imagine Sam Harris quoting that passage from the Sermon on the Mount and accepting it as what a great thing, if only we could defend it. That would seem impossible to him. I mean, there are definitely, and when he defends altruism by trying to show that it's part of one's own well-being, so yeah, not effective.
I think my question maybe dovetails with Don's a little bit, but have any of these individuals explicitly addressed Ayn Rand's ideas? So they actually said, you know, Ayn Rand says this, and this is my view, or is it just implicit that they've taken positions, you know, contrary?
I've not encountered it, but I've not gone online and looked at their speeches and stuff. So in the books, I don't think it's there at all.
Yeah, I haven't encountered it for Dawkins, other than me being on a radio program. But Harris has, though I don't know how extensively he's actually read into it. And I think it was after the publication of The Moral Landscape that he says he got letters from objectivists. But the way he paints them, and I could believe this happened, though he's abrasive in his form of argument, so I could believe there's also exaggeration. But it was the way he presents them, there was a sort of obnoxious element to them of, well, look, Ayn Rand's already shown that this is all wrong and this is the right approach, and how come you haven't got it, sort of thing. And he deals with some of the arguments there, but they're the arguments from the letter, I didn't see an engagement with Ayn Rand's actual writings and so on. So he may have read them, and he's certainly engaged on the issue, but I haven't seen it at a deep level.
Maybe we should make an effort to try to present some of these ideas maybe in a non-obnoxious manner, or I don't know, just in a way that they would really try to confront them. Maybe that's something to think about.
I found grasping Ayn Rand's unique understanding of the category of the arbitrary to be very helpful in understanding these questions. Dr. Ghate, you indicated something about that. Could you expand on the importance of maybe the understanding of the category of, well, Ayn Rand's unique understanding of the category of the arbitrary?
Yeah, you can see, for instance, Dawkins swinging back and forth between the metaphysics and the epistemology. So what atheism means is you're without belief in God. And so it's not the same thing as the position God does not exist. It's you don't have this idea because you have no evidence for it. And they make this kind of comparison, but they don't fully get it. God is like these unicorns and fairies and so on. But for all of these, you're an atheist in regard to them, or a fairyist, or whatever you want. Because you don't have a belief, because you don't have any evidence for them. The view that God doesn't exist, there is that position as well. And there's that position in objective. I mean, God's an anti-concept. And it's a complete rejection of the axioms. And from that perspective, it doesn't, just as contradictions don't exist. And you can say that. But he doesn't distinguish those two kinds of issues. And therefore, there's too much of an implication for him of saying, well, you don't have evidence for it, therefore you know it doesn't exist. But if you're in the 15th century and you don't have evidence for atoms, it doesn't follow, well, then atoms don't exist. And that's the confusion of epistemology and metaphysics. And they can't, Dawkins particularly can't separate that kind of issue. And objectivism makes a clear separation of that kind of issue.
Yeah, Dawkins, he has a scale from 1 to 7, I think it is, on radical atheism being 1, and the fullest form of certainty for theism being 7, and he's a 2. That is, he thinks we don't have any justification for being a number 1 atheist, that is, where you're certain that there is no God. That would be, and part of that is I guess related to the arbitrary. He thinks if you can conceive of something, in some sense of the word conceive, that is enough to take it seriously as a possibility. And
this is a question about the character of the new atheists, but also about holding them to their own views about the need for evidence. And what do you think about how worthwhile it would be to write articles or books with them as an audience, saying, look, if you really think we should only believe what there's evidence for, well, why are you assuming these Christian moral views so uncritically? And is there a role for a kind of Nietzschean genealogy of morality, a historical study showing how these views came from religion, that they didn't exist, to the same extent or in the same way in the ancient world, etc.? Would any of these people be open to it? I mean, they've been courageous to the extent that they have by rejecting God, and granted, it takes more courage to reject altruism. But are there enough of them out there where that kind of argument could maybe sow some seeds and encourage them to be just a little bit more courageous still?
Well, after hearing about Onkar's experience with Dawkins, it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to be positively inclined there. I would have thought so, but there is a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, this guy, Lawrence Krauss, he mentions, he's not a big fan of philosophy, but he'll mention, I have learned some things from philosophers, like, for example, Peter Singer has told him a lot, and others, Peter Unger, who's just like Peter Singer. So when they do mention these philosophers who they like and who think that these are people they claim to have done good work supporting ethics rationally, it's really altruistic stuff. That'd be a hard nut to crack. I think I would have thought Harris would be the easiest to convince. Hitchens actually in his life towards the end seemed to be moving away from altruism, and he made statements at the very end that seemed there was a limit to how much he had to live for others and that kind of thing. But he died too soon. And
I definitely think their audience is open to it.
That's important.
And that's who we should be trying to reach, and exactly on those kinds of issues, to force them to think about things they're taking for granted and in a way accepting on faith. I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity there.
You sort of just hit on this, but I wanted to say that they actually were the people who pulled me into philosophy, and so I think it seems like there may be a large audience there, particularly for objectivism, reaching out to people who tend to be on the left, where it's sometimes easier for us to reach out to the right. And I wanted to ask, I remember watching a debate between Hitchens and William Lane Craig where the point came out explicitly, how can you justify the existence or your belief in the existence of an objective morality? And Hitchens kept trying to transform that into the issue of whether or not an atheist can behave morally without God as an invigilator. And so I wonder if you think it would be worth an objectivist taking that kind of issue up, because I think it was very clear to many people who are fans of his that he lost that debate and on that issue, and that it may be a good thing for us to have something on.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I find you like Hitchens, I think, more than I do.
I know his limitations.
I find him the least philosophical, though he's better than
for sure.
Dennett, because Dennett, I think, is hopeless. And I don't know if you've seen any of the debates Dennett has had. He's not good at all. Hitchens isn't philosophical, sometimes knows he isn't, and sometimes, yeah, squirms. But there is a lot to get. I mean, this is why this is a quick question. If you don't have an answer to it, you're not in a good position, and what would it mean to have an answer to it? But those are the kinds of things that Harris is interested in, but I think goes wrong in various crucial ways.
Thanks.
I think it would have been easier to convince Harris or bring him over or whatever, alter his, influence his views 10 years ago than now, because I think he's gotten worse the deeper he's gotten into philosophy.
Yeah.
On the issue of their awareness of Rand, I saw Dawkins give a talk in Southern California once, and someone in the audience asked him fairly politely, surprisingly, if he'd read The Virtue of Selfishness. And he, as only the British can, he very politely said he hadn't read it, but which I took to mean he was completely dismissive and not interested. So, yeah. But the question is, so you mentioned, I think you both mentioned you were to say something about Dennett, and you had something on Dennett on sacred values.
Yeah,
So
I just wanted to mention.
I was just curious, yeah.
I
You
wanted
planted that, so I'd like to.
Oh, thank you. This is in connection with my lecture from earlier today, where I'd made the point there that in Ayn Rand's conception of sacred values, what's crucially important is the personal and private nature of the sacred values, especially one's own life, and the idea that it's one's own life that is a sacred value. But I also mentioned that there's nothing wrong with speaking of very abstract things, broad concretes like America, as sacred values, as long as you recognize that that's a derivative and it has to have an important connection to one's own life, one's own values. The reason I mention that is Dennett is cognizant of the fact that it's important. The whole idea of having, is something sacred. So he begins one of his books, I think, Breaking the, which one is it? Darwin's Dangerous Idea and Breaking the Spell. Both of those books he treats the issue of sacred values. And in fact, in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, the opening section is called, Is Nothing Sacred? And the very end of the book, he returns to, what is sacred? And the idea is, again, he's answering this challenge to atheists. How can anything be sacred if there isn't a God? And then he lists, and what the whole point of this is, he has the same problem I indicated. They're all kind of floating. There's not a conception of what is a genuine sacred value, what are the most highest values, most important values. So he rattles things off. Life, in one book, it's life, love, goodness, intelligence, beauty, humanity, and this world. Those are sacred values. And then in his later book, my sacred values are obvious and quite ecumenical. Democracy, justice, life, and truth in alphabetical order. But it's just kind of what's out there. And okay, in some sense, he does prefer non-totalitarian regimes to totalitarian. That's important to him. But it's got no oomph the way So it doesn't have the exaltation of religious values, nor what Ayn Rand replaces it with sacred values. That was my point with him.
I wonder if what you guys think about whether the new atheists have had appeal across the political spectrum, and if that's the case, why, and is there anything interesting about that?
I don't really know how wide it is. The interesting thing about the new atheists, and I think what it's quite good, whatever flaws we might see in their own system, is they've created a rift in, maybe that's too strong, but among the left, there are people who hate, I mean, the Chomsky, that kind of Greenwald, whatever the guy's name, those types really loathe the new atheists. And they loathe them for thinking that there's truth and falsehood, and we can judge different cultures based on that. I mean, the whole thing with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is, I think, counts as one of these people. She's a marvelous person. The incident at Brandeis, I mean, Sam Harris was actually quite good in defending her and denouncing her treatment by Brandeis University. So that doesn't really answer your question, but it's at least it says something about what's going on the left with respect to these people. I don't know enough about who on I would like to think some on the secular right, such as it exists, would respond to them, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a little bit, and that was the last point I made in my comments, that it has pulled some people in from the right, but the tendency, because they start to question their religion and it's wrong, and the tendency is they move to the left because of that package, that they think if I'm abandoning religion, then I abandon what it goes with, and that it goes with capitalism. And that means I have to move in some direction towards statism. And that's part of the problem, that it's right that they need to abandon their religion, but if it's that and capitalism, America doesn't have a chance.
You have mentioned that Ayn Rand was very brave to challenge altruism, and the new atheists are brave to challenge religion to a lesser extent. My question is, why do you think that they haven't been assassinated yet? Because we have observed, it kind of sounds funny, but we have observed on several occasions that anyone who spoke against Islam, every second person was shot or something happened to him. It's terrible. And why, when they speak so publicly and openly, no one is intimidating them? I personally know one person who was publishing criticism of Jewish religion on YouTube, and after about a year, he got a phone call and he was told, if you don't stop, you will have problems. So, is the fact that they are being so open about it and this proper marketing of their ideas that they're safe from intimidation? Because if you want to challenge religion, we need to know what is this formula that allows us the safety. And we can contrast speaking against religion with speaking against, for example, taxes. The way to speak against taxes is to pay the taxes so that you can openly speak against taxes, because you cannot be audited and put in jail. So that's the protection. But with the case of religion, what is the protection against those who will try to assassinate you because you're against God?
Well, first of all, I don't know, you said, I believe you implied that there was no intimidation against them, and that's not true. Christopher Hitchens was getting death threats at the end when, when Salman Rushdie visited him, there was all kinds of security, extra protection. And I think, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is on constant state of, has security people following her and stuff because of death threats. And I think Harris has mentioned really nasty hate mail and stuff.
Yeah, they both mentioned, and they mentioned it in the context of this is what brotherly love looks like.
Yeah, and it's the advantage of living in a civilized country. That's their protection. I mean, that it's not easy to kill them, but yeah, I don't know what else to say other than that. But it's not because of they're not on anyone's radar. I think they are.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering if you both could speak to more about how destructive it is for someone to believe in God. So before I used to think that, because there's a lot of people who believe in God, but in general they're pretty reality focused, they're not dogmatic, they're still open to evidence and so forth. But you know, Robert and you too, Onkar, you both raised a lot of commentary that got me thinking about how it's degrading a man, and I'm just curious what more you might have to say on this.
Well, you could almost look at it in a kind of case-by-case, because I've thought of that. I know a lot of people who are religious, and some of them are, they have very happy lives, it seems. They have really successful careers. So far as I can tell, good marriages. They enjoy their children. They go on vacations that are anything but otherworldly. And I often wonder, you know, are they so church on Sunday that it makes no difference in their lives? But I always find something happens or appears or occurs that suggests that to some extent their life has been undercut because of this. And just for example, I can think of at least a couple people who are very successful, although the scenario, but they're not really proud of their success. They don't see it as a moral achievement, right? That's what you're supposed to do. And that their morality comes from the fact that they do some charity work on the weekend or things like that. And it comes in a lot of, you know, there's something that undercuts it. I mean, you could go on and on with kinds of examples. Did that answer you, partially answer? I mean,
I find that you need to look at the issue from the positive. So it's what are they missing from life? And you have to have a really compartmentalized mind if you're going to take religion at all seriously. And there are some people who I think even are atheists and go to church because that's what you're supposed to do, or my wife goes, or my husband goes, and so on. And that creates problems of its own, including boredom. But I mean, that's a real issue. And not a deep relationship, because you can't talk about the deep things because you don't feel connected to the person in regards to it. But very compartmentalized. And Harris actually talks about it. He gets that phenomenon of compartmentalization. And there's a superficiality to it, because it is, if you go deep, that's when you start to see, well, no, these are not separate compartments. They're connected, and I have to think how. So there's not deep thinking going on, because they don't want to see how these things relate one to the other. So the fact that happiness is a deep state, and it's a deep state of integrated values. And it is, I don't think that's achieved in a compartmentalized mind that is reluctant to go places because it doesn't want to see what it will find.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I like your last comment, because having talked to Christians, that's how they survive. They have one compartment for living on earth, they have one compartment for being a good, religious, moral person, and they can't connect the two, or everything blows up. And you also have the Chinese menu method, which a lot of my students I talked about, they pick and choose from, if they're Catholics, yeah, I like sex and contraception, but I go to church. So they pick and choose, and of course the Pope's been complaining about that. But
yeah, cafeteria Catholics.
Yeah, that's how they survive. But anyway, I wanted to bring up something else. I think this discussion is a really good example of how negation is not a philosophy. Negating something isn't a philosophy, so you can't go anywhere from that if that's as far as you get. And two things I've noticed, and I'm doing a lot of research, including the Harris book from my book on free will, two things that come up over and over again. None of them understand the conceptual level, really, and how it differs from the perceptual level. They don't have a theory of how you form concepts. So it makes them extremely vulnerable to a lot of bad views and extremely stuck when they get into God. The second thing that comes up a lot is they Popper is a very, very bad influence as a philosopher of science, because he puts science backwards by saying the reason you progress is by proving, not disproving things or proving things not to be true, which is completely wrong. And one of you mentioned it in relation to axioms. If you use Popper, you can't go anywhere. It's a completely hopeless philosopher of science, and it's a great tragedy he's had so much influence, even though I think he's dead. People still cite that, but it's completely backwards and a disastrous policy. So one of the ways you have to attack these people is to tell them why you reject Popper, and then secondly, try to give them some indication of how you form a concept that's legitimate. Because the first error in God is it's an invalid concept, because you can't go anywhere, you can't get there. So those two things I've seen over and over again in my readings. And I read Harris's book. It's a very poor book, even for a determinist. It's very much secondhand. I was very disappointed to read it, but it's, again, if you don't have a philosophy, you can't get anywhere. And this is a very good example of it.
No. Thank you, Ed.
You spoke about some of the disagreements among the new atheists, and you spoke about some of the disagreements between the new atheists, and I guess I was curious which disagreements you take to be particularly important to notice, because I mean there's some disagreements like Dennett's critical review of Sam Harris's free will, and it seems like that's not really an important disagreement, but so I was curious which disagreements you take to be particularly important to notice and think about.
I wasn't aware of that he had a negative review of the book, and I've been slightly surprised by how quick they've been to write blurbs for each other's books, when I would have thought that this guy should be criticizing that guy, but here they are, this is wonderful, whatever. So I'm really not aware of major disagreements amongst them. I'll look up the Dennett review.
So they have, I'm not sure which disagreements you're referring to that we were talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, so they have different views with respect to, whether, for instance, so Sam Harris seems to be more willing to talk about ethics in a serious way, whereas Dawkins is, is not, just as one example.
Yeah, and I put it, it's disagreements, but it's that Harris is more philosophical, so he goes into issues that Dawkins takes for granted. So for instance, that kind of issue. But even on the metaphysical and epistemological issues, he goes deeper. But there is, I agree with Robert, they don't criticize one another very much. But you can read in, and if this is, in effect, his view of morality is different from Dawkins, and it's challenging some of the ways Dawkins approaches things. But they don't talk about themselves very critically. And it's in part because I think they face tremendous outward opposition,
right.
So it's a group that has banded together in a definite way.
Thank you.
How good or bad are their views on abortion? And are there differences there?
I think they're all pro-choice.
I imagine that they're pro-choice, but are they, do they have clarity on the issue? How would you, say, compare their stance on that specific issue relative to Ayn Rand's arguments and stance?
I don't know. I don't know the details of their views.
Yeah, I again know Harris the most. It's something like this, I think, is, on the one hand, there's a good element to it. So getting that what you need to look at is what a fetus actually is. And that a crucial part of the whole abortion debate is the idea of a soul implanted by God at the moment of conception. And if you're rejecting that, then the facts that are relevant, and he has a good idea of what the facts that are relevant to, but and I think both Dawkins and Harris have this kind of view of what matters is conscious states, well-being. Dawkins talks about post-speciesism, And it's getting away just from human being, that you're thinking about the states of just human beings. Harris has definite elements of that too. And that issue of, and if you take well-being, Harris ties well-being to conscious states, but it's not obvious why it has to be. And if you took it as living things, you could get a view that is pretty bad on the issue of abortion from that kind of premises. But he's good on, again, he's better on getting what's wrong with the position of the religiously minded that says there can't be a right to abortion than he is on developing a positive view. I think we're out of time. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.